Dear friends, I'm Professor Filip Kovacevic, and this is the 21st edition of the Russian newspaper's Monitor. I hope you are doing well today. Thanks for your support. The Newsbud community is getting bigger and bigger. The best is yet to come. Now, let's take a look at the front pages of the major Russian newspapers. First today, let's start with the front page of Izvestia, the moderate pro-government newspaper, the edition for February 17, 2017. At the bottom of the front page, on the left side, there is an article with the title, Russia will pay out the last debts of the Soviet Union. The subtitle explains that more than $100 million will be paid to Bosnia-Herzegovina. The article reports that Russia is getting ready to pay the last debts owed by the Soviet Union. Specifically, the Russian government will pay about $125 million to Bosnia-Herzegovina by the summer of this year. The article states that last week, the Russian government paid about $60 million to Macedonia, another former Yugoslav republic. These debts stem from the time of the socialist Yugoslavia and represent the percentage of the total debts that the Soviet Union owed to that country before both countries fell apart. The unnamed Russian official contacted by the newspaper said that all that was left to do was to sign the documents and the money for the payment will be ready. According to the Russian financial expert Alexander Bazukin, the Soviet debt to Yugoslavia came about as the result of the imbalance in trade relations. Yugoslavia exported to the Soviet Union more than the Soviet Union exported to Yugoslavia. The exports were essentially the consumer products, very much in demand in the Soviet Union at that time. Another expert contacted by the newspaper, the Russian economics professor Yuri Yudenkov, stated that the Soviet debt payments have a hidden political rationale. Russia needs allies in the international community, and one of the ways to acquire them is either to pay one's own debts promptly or to forgive the debts that the other countries owed Russia or the Soviet Union. According to Yudenkov, for this reason, Russia, for example, forgave the old Soviet debts to Vietnam and Algeria. Yudenkov added that at this time, due to a capitalist economic system in Russia, the corporate debt is much bigger than the government debt. According to the official data of the Russian Central Bank, the total foreign debt of the Russian government is rather low, at about $38.6 billion, while the debt of the Russian private sector is many times larger, at about $256 billion. In my opinion, Yudenkov is right. There is in this process of the Soviet debt repayment an evident geopolitical agenda. As I see it, it is not a coincidence that at this time, Russia is giving millions of dollars to Macedonia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. This so-called free money is the means to extend, amplify, and deepen the Russian influence in these two impoverished Balkan countries, destroyed by the Western neoliberal economic policies, and to turn their political elite and the population away from the NATO expansionist plans. I think that this strategy is bearing fruit in Macedonia and in the Serb entity of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Republika Srpska, where Russia is being perceived more and more as the honest broker and the stabilizing political actor. Now, let's take a look at Nezavisimaya Gazeta, the middle-of-the-road newspaper, the edition for February 17, 2017. On the bottom of the front page, in the middle, there is an article with a dramatic title, "The head of the Pentagon angered Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister." The subtitle explains that according to Shoigu, military contacts between the United States and Russia are possible, but the dialogue with Russia from the position of power has no perspective of success. The article reports that the head of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, and the US chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Danforth, met in Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan. According to the media reports, the meeting dealt with possible military cooperation between Russia and the United States, and its results were described as very constructive. However, almost at the same time, during the NATO defense ministers meeting in Brussels, the new US Defense Secretary, James Mattis, stated that the US and NATO should deal with Russia from the position of military superiority and dominant power. According to the article, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg wholeheartedly agreed with this statement. However, both Mattis and Stoltenberg received almost immediate reply from the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Shoigu stated that Russia was willing to cooperate with the United States in military matters, but approaching it from the position of superiority or dominance has no perspective of being successful. The article notes that Mattis' statement may not be all that surprising, considering that from 2007 to 2009, he was in charge of the strategic transformation of NATO forces in Europe, which included many of the measures we are seeing today. The article describes several recent incidents involving the US and Russian militaries, including the Pentagon claims that the Russian military planes conducted dangerous maneuvers above the US destroyer Porter in the Black Sea. The Russian military denied these claims, saying that the planes were flying above neutral waters next to the Russian maritime borders, while the United States ship was tens of thousands of miles away from its own home port. The article notes that NATO promised to increase the number of ships present in the Black Sea at any given time. NATO activities may even lead to the violation of the Montreux Convention, which limits the amount of time that foreign military ships could spend in the Black Sea. The article claims that the convention was already violated in 2014 during the outbreak of the Ukrainian crisis, when the US frigate Taylor was in the Black Sea 11 days longer than the convention allows. According to the article, the increased NATO military pressure on Russia may be compounded by the more extensive US military engagement in Syria, in cooperation with the Turkish military. The article cites the media reports which claim that the US may send regular military troops to Syria. Though it is no secret that some US special forces are already there, this would mean the substantial increase of the US military presence. The media reports talk about several thousands of US troops being dispatched to the Syrian-Turkish border regions. If true, these developments may put the existing de facto Russian-Turkish military alliance in Syria under a very heavy strain. In my opinion, the question here is, what is more important to the Turkish government, to fight against the Islamic State in cooperation with Russia, or to try to get rid of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in cooperation with the United States? Of course, this difficult choice for the Turkish President Erdogan could be sidestepped by the US and Russia finally making a deal and working together to clear Syria of all ISIS terrorists. Isn't this what the US President Donald Trump said he would like to do? And also, isn't this why Gerasimov and Danford met in Baku? Still, it is very likely that there is a powerful faction within the Pentagon, speaking out perhaps through the Secretary Mattis, that sees Russia and not the Islamic State as a threat number one to the US national security interests. This faction may cause serious problems to the conception and practice of the US-Russia détente. It remains to be seen how it will go about doing so. In my opinion, we already caught a glimpse of its modus operandi with the alleged accidental bombing of the Turkish soldiers by the Russian Air Force. It is highly probable that these Pentagon's factions agents of influence in the Turkish military passed on to the Russian military the incorrect target information purposefully aimed at the Turkish troops. Only through Putin's immediate phone conversation with Erdogan and his quick apology was the crisis averted. This incident must be seriously investigated. Otherwise, similar incidents will soon happen again. Let's stay with Nezavisimaya Gazeta, the middle-of-the-road newspaper, and let's take a look at the front page for another edition, the edition for February 20th, 2017. In the middle of the front page, there is an article about the 2017 Munich Security Conference. There is a photo of the US Vice President Michael Pence giving a speech there. In the front row, one can see the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. The title of the article is Munich Demonstrated the Total Confusion of Western Elites. The article explains that the Western elites have been unable to come up with realistic responses to the challenges facing Europe at this time. The article notes that in his speech, the Vice President Pence repeated several phrases that are very similar to the phrases used by the previous Obama administration. For instance, Pence claimed that the US would hold Russia accountable for the continuing conflict in eastern Ukraine. According to the article, this claim is in contradiction with the statements made earlier by the US President Donald Trump, and it added to the already existing bewilderment of the European politicians and experts. The article quotes Pence's statements that the US is, quote, Europe's main ally in the present and in the future, end quote, and that the United States, quote, decisively supports NATO, end quote. However, he also said that the European countries needed to increase their financial contributions to the NATO budget. He explicitly stated that this was what the US President Donald Trump expected of the European NATO allies. According to the article on the subject of Russia, Pence essentially repeated the claims frequently made by the high-level officials of the Obama administration, such as, for instance, Victoria Nuland. Pence claimed that Russia was the main destabilizing factor in Ukraine and that Russia was responsible for the failure of the Minsk Accords. According to the article, Pence received something of a rebuke from the new German Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel, a social democrat, who stated that there was no way that Germany could allocate additional billions of dollars for the military at the time when the German public demanded the reduction in federal and state taxes. The Chancellor Angela Merkel, a Christian Democrat, on the other hand, stated that Germany would put more money into defense. In my opinion, this kind of public disagreement between the two high-level German politicians should be seen in light of the coming presidential elections in September 2017, in which the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats will run against each other. According to the main editor of the Nezavisimaya Gazeta, Konstantin Remchukov, who was present at the Munich Security Conference, the election of Trump brought in so many uncertainties about the next steps that the US plans to take in its foreign and economic policies that many European politicians and experts do not really know what to think or say. Remchukov said that in his 30 years of dealing with the European political elites, he had never seen so much confusion and anxiety about the future. It appears almost certain, as I have mentioned in many of my articles for BFP and Newsbud, that the neoliberal global paradigm established after the breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War has collapsed. It is still not clear what it will be replaced by. However, according to Remchukov, it is evident that the United States under Trump has no intention of resuming the functions of the policeman of the world that has been the main orientation of the US foreign policy in the last 20 years. This means that other great powers, such as Russia and China, need to be engaged on equal terms in the construction of the new non-neoliberal world order. In my opinion, the contradictory foreign policy pronouncements of Pence and Trump should be focused on more closely because they may point to a future serious rift within the Trump administration. These contradictions, in my opinion, are not accidental. Pence is a representative of the Washington foreign policy establishment, which is intensely, if not always publicly, against Trump's ideas. Pence is definitely pushing into this direction, and his statements at the Munich Security Conference prove it. It is also no coincidence that Trump's national security advisor Michael Flynn was fired precisely because of an alleged miscommunication with Pence. I think that Flynn and Pence did not get along from the very beginning because they represented two different views of the future US role in the world, and it was only a question of time when one of them would be forced out. Who knows? Perhaps Trump made a big mistake in terms of the sustainability of his own presidency by firing Flynn and keeping Pence. The time will tell, and I think it's going to be sooner than later. Now, let's take a look again at the front page of Izvestia, the moderate pro-government newspaper, but this time the edition for February 21st, 2017. On the left side of the front page, there is an article about the sudden death of the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vitaly Churkin. There is a color photograph of Churkin next to the title which says, "He fought for the country, he defended Russia." The subtitle explains that Churkin died suddenly in New York City at age of 65. The article describes Churkin as one of the most influential Russian diplomats and a great man. It states that it will be difficult to imagine the Russian diplomatic service without Churkin, as he was the Russian ambassador to the United Nations for the past 11 years. The article notes that Churkin radiated self-confidence and possessed a tremendous expertise in international affairs. He knew how to defend Russia's foreign policy decisions during the frequently hostile discussions at the UN Security Council, and he did so with skill and conviction. Those who disagreed with him often found themselves disarmed by the strength and cogency of his arguments. He did not make it easy for the US ambassadors to the UN, such as the former President Obama's appointee, Samantha Power. The author of the article writes that she met Churkin for the first time in 2015. She was impressed by his easygoing manner and his willingness to take time out of his busy schedule to give the Russian journalists a tour of the UN building and tell them interesting anecdotes about various historical events and personalities. The article also briefly presents Churkin's biography. He joined the diplomatic service in 1974, soon after graduating from Russia's most prestigious university for international affairs, MGIMO. He worked for 5 years within the foreign ministry in Moscow and was sent to the United States for the first time in 1979. In 1990, he was the press secretary of the last Soviet foreign minister, Eduard Shevardnadze. In April 1992, he became a deputy foreign minister and was assigned to be the Russian representative in the peace negotiations in the former Yugoslavia. In October 1994, he became the Russian ambassador to Belgium and the head of the Russian delegation in NATO. After that, he was appointed the ambassador to Canada, and in 2006 became the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, the post he held for 11 years and for which he will be most remembered. The article includes the statements by Churkin's closest colleagues and friends in the Russian diplomatic service: Sergei Ryabkov, the Russian deputy foreign minister; Sergei Orjokinidze, the former deputy to the UN Secretary General; Maria Zakharova, the press secretary of the Russian Foreign Ministry; Leonid Slutsky, the head of the International Affairs Committee in the Duma; and Konstantin Kosachev, the head of the International Affairs Committee in the Federation Council. They all praised Churkin's diplomatic work and stated that he made an invaluable contribution to contemporary Russian diplomacy. In my opinion, the sudden loss of Churkin, who after the foreign minister Sergei Lavrov was the most well-known Russian diplomat in the West, is definitely a shock for the Russian diplomatic community and may affect the effectiveness of its foreign policy agenda in the coming period. Very few Russian diplomats could communicate the Russian foreign policy initiatives with such clarity, confidence, and skill to the Western friends and foes. It will be difficult to find an adequate replacement for Churkin. This loss comes at a time when the aggressivity of the anti-Russian and anti-Putin forces in the United States and Europe has reached a new and dangerous high. Churkin's death also extends the tragic series of the deaths of the top-level Russian diplomats, most of whom were in their 60s. In addition to the assassination of the Russian ambassador to Turkey in December, some of the other deaths also took place under suspicious circumstances. At this time, there is no indication that there was any foul play in Churkin's case. But at this level in the power hierarchy, one can never be sure, and no doubt many theories will spring up in the blogosphere. Lastly today, let's take a look at the front page of Rossiyskaya Gazeta. the Russian government-owned newspaper, the edition for February 22nd, 2017. On the top of the front page, there is an article with the title, "The Weapons Park." The subtitle explains that the Russian Ministry of Defense is buying new weapons while taking into consideration the weapons' performance during the Russian military intervention in Syria. The article is in fact an exclusive interview with the Russian Deputy Defense Minister Yuri Borisov about the Russian weapons used in Syria and the way their performance is influencing the acquisition and development of new weapons. Borisov stated that the effectiveness of the Russian weapons used in Syria was positively commented on even by NATO. He said that the air and sea-based rockets demonstrated the especially high-quality performance and that the ministry would acquire more of those. According to Borisov, the intervention in Syria served as a perfect testing ground for new Russian weapons and technologies. He stated that the groups of the Russian military specialists examined the performance of all types of weapons in Syria. They noted their problems and deficiencies and were already at work making them more effective. In terms of the new weapons, Borisov mentioned a new fighter aircraft, MiG-35, and a new type of a Navy ship, which is a 4,000-ton frigate of the project 22350. He also talked about a new tank, Armata, a new armored carrier, Boomerang, and a new infantry fighting vehicle, Kurganets. According to Borisov, they are all equipped with protection against all existing anti-tank weapons. Borisov also said that at this time, multi-layer tests were being made for another new fighter aircraft, a Sukhoi T-50, which will be based on the most advanced stealth technology. According to Borisov, the Russian military will present new weapon systems at the International Weapons Exposition Army 2017, which will be held in Moscow in August 2017. The presentation will include new radio electronic complexes, new drones, robotic technologies, and navigation systems. Borisov also promised quite a few surprises for international visitors and weapons buyers. In terms of the budgetary investments in the new weapons and technologies for the next fiscal year, Borisov stated that the Russian government would spend about 1.4 trillion rubles, which is about $25 billion. He stated that on January 1st, 2017, about 58% of the total weapons and technologies in use by the Russian military could be categorized as advanced and new. Borisov said that the Russian government's plan was to raise the percentage of the new and advanced technologies to 70% by 2020. In addition, the new Russian government is planning to modernize and upgrade the Russian nuclear forces. Borisov also stated that the Russian Navy in the Arctic and the Far East would receive significant new funding. The Russian government is supposed to unveil a strategy of development until 2025 in the second quarter of this year. In my opinion, this article shows that the Russian government is paying a great deal of attention to and spending a lot of money on the modernization and development of its military. The Syrian intervention proved to be an effective and useful testing ground, and now the Russian military engineers and weapons constructors know what works and what does not. This should be a warning signal to NATO that their overt and covert campaigns to coerce Russia militarily in caving in to its geopolitical agenda have no chance of being successful. The earlier the NATO leaders, including the United States, realize that the less money will be spent on the weapons and technologies of mass destruction, and more will be left for the projects of mass construction and well-being, such as schools, hospitals, the arts, and the bread and butter issues, both in the West and in the East. Dear friends, that's all for today. Thank you for watching. Please support Newsbud with your donations or your membership. And of course, be cool and stay cool until the next edition of the Russian Newspapers Monitor.
For just a small subscription fee, you can become a member of the Newsbud community and help keep this website running. Your subscription will provide you with full community access to exclusive content, including videos and articles from Newsbud's team of experts and analysts, as well as a members-only monthly newsletter from Newsbud's founder, Sibel Edmonds. Sign up today for full access at newsbud.com.